If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, please submit them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The death of the civil servant. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. What happened to the term civil servant? Honestly, I've not heard that term used in 20 years. The idea was that workers who earned their living in the public sector were serving society, and not so much anymore. Sand on the tracks. Roy Orr was a Democrat who served a term as the president of the National Association of Counties. I was once part of a leadership group interviewing Mr. Orr, and he continually used the phrase, sand on the tracks. He said, that's all we were, sand on the tracks. Okay, here's the explanation. If a train gets stuck on a steep hill or tracks are iced over, they throw sand on the tracks for traction. The sand gets smashed by the extremely heavy locomotive. During a visit to a policymaking committee in Washington, he was dismayed that the staff was not showing much interest in his proposals. Bureaucrats told him in private, "You're just sand on the tracks," meaning Mr. Orr would soon be gone, and the bureaucrat could do whatever he wanted. See why this podcast is titled The Death of the Civil Servant? That's because they're not serving society anymore. They're serving their own self-interest. Work is good. That's the title of podcast number 24, and it earns a spot on the 10 Biblical Commandments of Economics in the book titled Biblical Economic Policy that I wrote with Sergei Seidamatov. When folks work in the private sector, they work in a competitive environment. That means they must serve the customer before they get served. It's one of my favorite lessons of economics that I'll explain to my sophomores at Dallas Baptist University just next week. In a competitive environment, the firm must first serve the customer before the firm gets served. In a competitive environment, discrimination harms the discriminator, but the public arena is non-competitive. People work in a monopoly. There's only one street department, one sewer department, one police department, and one public library. If you don't like their service, you have no competitive supplier to switch to. Okay, certainly there are good people who work in government. In the Christian worldview, we believe everything was made for God's good purpose, but all of it can be used for bad purposes. My point today is that public government jobs encourage the fallen nature, while the private competitive sector punishes the fallen nature. Historically, civil servants were paid less than private servants. The reason was a simple concept from finance: risk and return. Working in the public sector was seen as having less risk, so there was less pay. Now that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? When the economy is bad, as it is today, I could read a dozen business headlines about companies laying off employees. Workers in the private sector lose their jobs. In the public service corps, there seldom are staff reductions. The assumption is that when others lose their jobs, there's even more work for the public sector to do to make up for it. In economics, John Maynard Keynes said that the government must spend against the wind, and he was right. Banks and other private institutions naturally retreat in the face of a recession. If every entity does that, it takes a long time to recover from the recession. Now, while the purpose of government is more than economic, it does make sense that historically there's been a trade-off of risk and return working in the public sector. You had less risk of layoff, but you made less money. Not so today. Public employees make more than private employees, so they have less risk and greater return. Pretty good gig if you can get it. You know what NARFE is? N-A-R-F-E. Ginger and I are learning more about it because their regular meetings often earn a photo and a story in our local newspaper. It stands for National Active and Retired Federal Employees Association. Here's why that's disturbing. Their salaries and retirement benefits are paid by the taxes extracted from the profits of the private sector. Everyone likes profit. The idea of profit deserves an entire podcast all its own. It might even be more than a podcast, maybe even a full book. The longer I've studied Christian economics, the more clear has become the importance of profits. I end each podcast with the phrase, Fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. Profits. Without them, we can't keep the biblical command to give. Without them, no salaries could be paid in the private sector. Without them, there'd be nothing for government to tax. Now think about this. These folks I'm talking about today who want a bigger government, if you just follow the logic chain one short step, you find that they want more profit because that's what they tax to pay for a larger government. In his landmark book, Economics in One Lesson, Henry Hazlitt encourages us to think to the next step in the economic chain. That's all you have to do to see that even the most liberal Democrat wants higher profits in the private sector so she can tax them. One of my fellow Christian economists, Ann Bradley, in her book titled Be Fruitful and Multiply, refers to them as leftovers. And she clearly makes the point that without leftovers, nothing to give to your church and there's nothing to tax. That's why one of my first podcasts, podcast number 2, was titled The Prophet Who Made a Profit. Jesus had to make a profit to keep the Jewish commandment to give. Okay, we sometimes call this agency. It questions whether the employee is working for the stakeholders or for their own self-interest. That's one of the strengths of economics. We assume self-interest, which in theological terms is called a fallen nature. Now, when you hear the phrase follow the money, in economic terms, we say understand self-interest. In the Christian worldview, the purpose of taxing is to fight evil. That's why one of the most honored professions in society is the police force. I used to tell a friend of mine who was a career Fort Worth policeman, you separate evil from good. There's no higher calling in society. That's what police do. And we should be forever grateful. But just a glance at the U.S. debt clock shows us that the 2 biggest expenditures of the federal government are health care and Social Security. National security is third on the list, occupying just under 13% of federal spending. Neither of those first 2 items has a biblical basis. Both of those and many other governmental activities were assigned to the church in biblical terms. Oh, while we're looking at it, debt is the 4th largest expenditure at just under 9% of federal expenditures. Career politicians. Now let's do a roll call of presidents in reverse order. President Biden is a Democrat who is a career politician. He has never produced any consumer surplus. President Trump is a Republican who is an immensely successful businessman and produced millions of dollars in consumer surplus. President Obama, a Democrat who was a career politician who never employed one person in the private economy. George Bush, a Republican who was a successful oil man from Texas and part owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team before he got into politics. Bill Clinton is a Democrat who never had a job in the private sector. President George H.W. Bush is a Republican who was a successful oil man before he went into public service. You want me to keep going? Okay, Ronald Reagan is a Republican who had a successful acting career. Jimmy Carter. Finally, we find a Democrat who is not a career politician. He owned and operated a peanut farm before he was elected governor of Georgia, then president of the United States. Okay, let's keep going. Gerald Ford was a Republican who, after serving nobly in the Navy, was mostly a career politician. Richard Nixon was a Republican who was a successful lawyer in California before he entered political life. Democrat Lyndon Johnson owned a ranch in Texas, but he was mostly a career politician. Keep going. John F. Kennedy was a Democrat who was a career politician, and the family business was politics. Back to another current office holder. Vice President Kamala Harris is a Democrat who never produced anything in the private sector. You're welcome to think about your senators, governor, and your congressman. If she's a Republican, it's very likely she was in the private sector before entering public life, while most Democrats are career politicians who never made a profit, paid a salary, nor created any consumer surplus. They lived off the profits of the private sector. Mike Pompeo makes the same statement in his new book titled Never Give an Inch. He writes about the current administration, quote, None of the Biden team have run a major corporation, and it's hard to figure out which, if any, have signed the front side of a paycheck. The detachment from economic reality is obvious, says Mr. Pompeo. Specialization. So the best combination is a citizen legislative group and a professional bureaucracy. By the way, that term bureaucracy, a bureau is a desk, so it means rule from the desk. I can't think of any positive use of the term bureaucracy. The term red tape derives from the time when royal orders arrived wrapped in red ribbons. Again, that's a negative term. The founding fathers clearly intended to have lay legislators or civilian legislators who were involved in the production and distribution of goods and services for their own economic support. Those are people who understood the value of profit that supported the federal government. In closing, my 10-year-old grandson and I were putting stones along a very small waterway in our pasture recently, and he noticed, we can't live without water, but it can kill us. Good point. Everything made good by God can be used for ill, including civil service. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time. For more information, please visit us online at davearnott.com. If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, please submit them online or in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.